came to love the Psalms, not least because they teach us how to feel, but perhaps even more significantly, they teach us how to pray. And so I love to pray the Psalms. And you've heard me pray this prayer, goodness, 100 times by now. I begin almost every sermon with it. The Psalm taught me to pray like this. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. Because of your mercy, because of your truth. We pray in the name of the one who loved us and gave himself for us, our Redeemer, Jesus. Amen. In my library, I have a book that I've treasured for a long time. Actually, it was given to me by a student. It's kind of odd. Back in the days when I taught at Beeson Divinity School. The book was written actually by a man who was, at the time, a professor at Reformed Seminary right here in Jackson, named Richard Pratt. He now runs a ministry that teaches preachers all over the world. It's a great ministry down in Florida, Orlando area. Anyway, Richard Pratt, Dr. Richard Pratt. The title of the book is this. He, meaning God, he gave us stories. Well, the thesis of the book is this, that we've known this for centuries, that most of the Bible is in the form of stories. Now, sometimes we hear the word story and think, well, that refers to something that's just made up. No. A story can be true, it can be a true story, it can be a made-up story, but the Bible is full of true stories. God gave us stories. In fact, most of the Bible, about 75% of the Bible is stories. That's why at Vacation Bible School times and in Sunday school classes, we teach children stories because we remember stories. Stories are easy to remember. And they teach us a lot, and they're easy to recall. And we keep them in our memories for years. So, God gave us stories. And the Old Testament especially, the New Testament too, but the Old Testament especially, even more than 75% stories. And one of those most beautiful stories, one that you've heard many times, you've heard at weddings 1,000 times, is the story of Ruth. Well, that's our book for the day. As we journey through the Bible, we have come to the book of Ruth. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, first 5 books, the Torah, Joshua, Judges last Sunday, and now Ruth. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is not number 8, as it is in our English Bibles. That came later. That order came later. Ruth is actually one of the last books in the Hebrew Bible. But that's not particularly important right now. It's a story. And one reason it's put where it's put is that in the very opening words we read that during the days of the judges. So it comes right after the book of Judges because the story is set during the time of the judges. And we preached on the judges last week. So the book of Ruth is a story. I'm going to outline it here in just a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Aristotle to come and speak to us for a moment. Anybody who studies drama, like if you studied drama in college or high school, anywhere, you would probably learn Aristotle's 6 elements of drama. Aristotle, who was the tutor of Alexander the Great, he lived back in the 4th century BC, 300 plus years before Christ. But in his day, of course, drama was a very important part of Greek life. They didn't have TV and internet and movies and such, or baseball games or football games. They had drama. They had the theater. Okay? And there are still, by the way, there are Greek theaters that are still standing. I've been in some of them. So anyway, Aristotle wrote in one of his books, his book is called The Poetics, and in that book, he gives us what goes into making a drama a drama. In other words, what goes into making a story a story. And he said there were 6 elements, and here they are. Well, actually, I'm going to reserve the first 3 because those I'm going to focus on those this morning. But the last 3 are music. In Greek drama, there was always a chorus in the background that they would sing or chant. Well, we have the same thing. In a movie today, you'll have background music, a musical score, like a movie like Bond will be da 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 da, and so we know about that. There is also in a drama, Aristotle said, there is language, there is the dialogue, there is the script. Okay. And then number 6 of the elements, he called it the spectacle. And what he meant by that was all the stage props and the costumes and all that stuff. Okay, we have the same things today. But remember, Aristotle was talking about the Greek drama that's presented in a theater, not about the story like a written story, like the book of Ruth. So that takes us back to the first 3 elements. And I want you to hold on to these because we're going to look at these for the next 3 weeks. Aristotle's first 3 elements of a story. These are the crucial elements. Here they are. Plot, character, theme. There they are. Plot, character, theme. So let's go to the book of Ruth. For this week, next week, when we look at Samuel, and by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, Samuel is just 1 book. It's not 2 books. That's an artificial division that came much later, like the 16th century. In the Hebrew Bible, it's just 1 book. And you'll see next week why it should be 1 book. Same is true of Kings, 1 book. So for the next 2 weeks, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, we're going to use Aristotle's 3 elements of a story. Plot, character, theme. And see how these stories are told and why they're told the way they're told and what it means to us. So let's go to the book of Ruth. This is a good place to begin. By the way, we could have done the same thing with Judges or with Joshua. They were stories too. But we're going to begin with Ruth because it's short. And many people already know the story of Ruth. They already know the story of how a woman named Naomi married to a man named Elimelech. They lived in Bethlehem, of course, where Jesus was born. And because of a famine in the land of Israel, they have to go to Moab, which is today Jordan, southern Jordan. So they went across what is the Dead Sea, the Jordan Valley, into Moab, and they lived there for over 10 years, and they had 2 sons, and they married Moabite women. One was named Oprah, the other was named Ruth. Well, Elimelech died, and the 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they both died. And so Naomi, the widow now, bereft of her husband and her sons, is going to move back. She's heard that the Lord has blessed Israel with bread now, so there's food. So they go. She's going to go back to Bethlehem, and the 2 daughters-in-law start to go with her. She tells them, "Don't go. What are you going to go for? Because I don't have any more sons for you to marry. Go back to your father's house and start over." Oprah does go back, but as you know, Ruth does not. Where you go, I will go. Your God, my God, your people, my people. Where you dwell, I'll dwell, and so forth and so on. That great passage that you hear read at weddings. That pledge of Ruth's faithfulness. They go back to Bethlehem. Ruth goes to glean in a barley field. It's the barley harvest, which is in April. So she is gleaning, that is, she's picking up what the reapers have left and didn't pick up, and hoping to get enough to sustain her and Naomi, just to meet their daily needs. And as God would have it, she is gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know who Boaz is. But it happens that Boaz is a near relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband who died. And when Naomi realizes that, she makes a suggestion to Ruth that she make herself available as his wife. And I'm going to explain all that later when we get to theme. But the end of it, the story is, of course, that Boaz does marry Ruth. and they have a son named Obed, and that son is the grandfather of King David. I want you to turn to the end of the book of Ruth, chapter 4. I just gave you the plot. I'm sorry. I gave you a little outline of the book. I just recounted the story. But the plot, the great purpose for which the book of Ruth is written is to reveal something very important to us. So let me ask you to look at the very end. Now, Josiah read those verses 13 through, 16, Josiah, in chapter 4. And so, or 17. And let me read 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him, that is, the son of Boaz and Ruth, gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. Nothing terribly significant about that name. It means worker or possibly worshiper. And what the connection was, we're not quite sure. We're not told there. It doesn't matter. But the neighbor ladies gave him the name. And he was the father of Jesse. And Jesse, of course, was the father of David. And then to make sure we don't miss it, this is why I say this is the plot. The plot is at the very end of the book. Now, these are the generations of Perez, one of the ancestors, one of the descendants of Abraham, and one of the ancestors of David. The generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Notice twice in chapter 4 we're told. And Jesse fathered David. What's the plot of the book of Ruth? The plot hinges on one thing. This is a record of God's providential work to prepare for King David. And why does that matter? Because the Messiah is going to be, as we're going to see next week in 2 Samuel, the Messiah is going to be a king in the line of David. He's going to be a son of David. So the book of Ruth is pointing toward the Messiah, the son of David. As if to say to the people of Israel, okay, this is how David came to be born. He came to be born by way of a Moabite woman and an old man. Wow. Which brings us to the second element of Aristotle that is important for us, and that is character. There are three main characters in the book of Ruth. Three main characters. We're going to see in Samuel there are certain main characters, and we're going to see this in Kings too. But there are three main characters in the book of Ruth. They are Naomi. I will come to her last. Ruth, of course, the Moabite woman, not an Israelite. By the way, let me just stop a little bracket right here and say, if you go to the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, there are two of them. One's in Matthew, one's in Luke. If you go to those genealogies, you will find 4 women mentioned. Only 4. All the rest are men. 4 women mentioned. And every one of those women have like a question mark beside their name. There's Bathsheba, with whom David committed adultery. And among them is Ruth, who wasn't an Israelite. Well, one reason for the book of Ruth is to say to the Israelites, don't feel so high and mighty. Yeah, you are descendants of Abraham. You are the children of Abraham. But in the line of your greatest king, David, is a Moabite woman, not an Israelite. Which also says to the whole world, God is no respecter of persons. Wow. That's all part of the plot of Ruth. So, Naomi is a character, we'll come to her. Ruth, another main character, and of course, the kind of hero of the story. We sometimes think Ruth is the hero. No, Ruth is not the hero. Boaz is the hero. I said I'd come to Naomi in a moment. So let's look just for a moment at Ruth and Boaz. Very interesting that we're told the very same thing about them both. And it's captured in one word. I want you to look with me at chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, at the very beginning. Now, Naomi, this is after Naomi and Ruth have arrived back in Bethlehem. And we are told at the end of chapter 1 that it's the time of the barley harvest. And that would be in April. It's a very early harvest in Israel. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a relative of Elimelech, who had died, remember, in Moab. And it says, what does it say about this man? Tell me, church. He was what kind of a man? All right, so I forgot I'm going to have to explain this. Yeah, the Hebrew word is chayil. Chayil. Like, clear your throat and say yell, but with an I. Chayil. So, chayil sometimes is translated wealthy, but we know that's not what it means here. It doesn't mean here that he's rich. We know that from what we read about him later on. No, and the fact that this same word is used of Ruth. Well, Ruth certainly wasn't rich. If anything, she was poverty-stricken. She wasn't rich. No, that word chayil, yeah, in certain contexts, if it's clear, it can mean rich, but not usually. What it usually means is honorable, worthy, godly, righteous. Like a paladin. That's what it means. The very same word is used of Gideon in the book of Judges. The very same word is used of Barak in the book of Judges, both godly men. The very same word is used of King David. He was a chayil, a worthy, godly man. That was Boaz. That helps explain something about Boaz. Since I mentioned, I was going to mention Ruth first, but let me go to Boaz. If you look there in chapter 2, whenever Ruth goes to glean in the field, and she doesn't know anything about Boaz at this point. We know because we get in on it, and Naomi, of course, knows, but at this point, even Naomi doesn't know this is where Ruth is. Ruth is in the field, and it turns out it's the field of Boaz. So we read that when Boaz realizes this woman is out there gleaning, this is in verse 4, he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you," and they said, "The Lord be with you, the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge, like the foreman of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this? Who is this young woman?" And they explained, "This is Ruth, Naomi's daughter, blah, 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 blah." And so Boaz says in verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." Now, I've actually heard sermons where preachers who didn't know any better, shame on them, where a preacher said something like this: "Yeah, we all understand what's going on here. Boaz," and Boaz is an old man, we know that, because he says so later on. He tells us, "I'm an old man." And I've heard preachers say something like this, and I almost shiver to even repeat it. And here is Boaz, the old man. He sees this beautiful Moabite woman, and so he says, "Don't leave the field," because he's got her in his gun sights. Like some kind of a lecherous old man. That's poppycock. That's borderline heresy. The scripture says he was a worthy man, a godly man. In fact, later on, when he describes Ruth, here's what he says: "Everything that you've done for your mother-in-law has been told to me. You are a worthy woman." He uses the very same word of Ruth. So the bottom line is this. I could go on and on with these character sketches, but the bottom line is this. What Ruth tells us about these two principal characters, Boaz and Ruth, is that they were both godly, chayil, worthy. Ruth, of course, we see it in her faithfulness to Naomi. And Boaz, we see at the end, whenever Ruth makes known the request of Naomi that he become the redeemer of the family by marrying her, by what he says to her, all that you have done has been reported to me, and so I will take on this responsibility. And he even mentions the fact that, you did not go after young men, you came, you asked me. Who does that? That tells us what kind of a woman Ruth was. Okay, let's go to the third character, though. This is the really important. Who would you guess is the most important character in the book of Ruth? Tell me, who do you think? Who's the most important character in the book of Ruth? Yeah, somebody said it. Will, did you say that? Good for you, young man. It is Naomi. Naomi is the most important. Well, Boaz, you could argue Boaz is in a way, but I'll get to that in a minute. Naomi is the most important. Naomi is what in drama we would call the protagonist, the leading character. She's almost in the background in many people's minds, but no. She's the most important character. How do we know that? Well, look at this. In chapter 1, first of all, in chapter 1, verse 5, we read, when they're in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion, her two sons, died, so that the woman, i.e. Naomi, was left without her two sons and her husband. So the stage is set. This is how the story begins, with the plight of Naomi. Her husband is gone. Her sons are gone. You understand what it means to be a widow? 1,000 years before Christ. There's no Social Security. There's no widow's benefit. There's no life insurance. There is nothing. A widow in the ancient world was the most helpless, the most hopeless of all people. Nobody. That's why Paul instructs Timothy to take special care of the widows in the church, because they were the most helpless and the most hopeless and the most needy of all people were the widows. So the stage is set in Ruth with Naomi, who's lost her husband, and her sons who might have cared for her. She is utterly hopeless. Or again, at the end of chapter 1, let me show you this. When she gets back into Bethlehem, so the two of them, we read in verse 19, Ruth and Naomi, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Well, Naomi, the name means something like pleasant or comfortable or something like that. Capernaum, where Jesus spent much of his ministry, Capernaum, is related to the word Naomi, a place of pleasantness, so to speak. And she says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. That word appears also in the book of Exodus. A place of bitter water. Mara. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. That means bitter. Why? Because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So the story begins with Naomi, bereft of a husband and sons, and utterly hopeless and helpless in the world. And she calls herself Mara, bitter. That's what life has dealt to Naomi. Well, we know that she's the most important character also because at the very end of the book, and we've already read, Josiah read this, and I've already read it again as well. So Boaz takes Ruth, and she becomes his wife. And then the very same women who had come to her when she got back into Bethlehem and asked, "Is this Naomi?" And she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." These very same women, now that Boaz has married Ruth and has born a son, these very same women come, and here's what they say: "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life." And that leads us very naturally to the third of Aristotle's elements. First, plot. This is the story of God's making a way for the coming of King David. There are the characters, Ruth, Boaz, but especially the helpless and hopeless Naomi. And then there is the theme. What's the theme? Well, the theme revolves around a word. It appears here, and it appears all through the Bible. The word is goel. If you were spelling it, it would look like G-O, go, apostrophe, and then E-L, goel. Comes from a verb, ga'al, and ga'al means to redeem. Well, a goel is a redeemer, is someone who redeems. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the Old Testament, and we won't take time to look at it because there are lots and lots of verses that talk about this, but take my word for it for now. You can look in Leviticus and elsewhere. But in ancient Israel, part of God's law for Israel was this: that if a man died without having any children, then his nearest kinsman, a brother or a near relative, if the brother wasn't available, a near kinsman was to take his wife as his own wife to raise up children in the name of the dead brother. Does that make sense? Okay. That was the law of Israel. It also applied to land. So if a man became poor and had to sell his land, because remember, this land was given by God as an inheritance, and it wasn't to leave the family. So if a man became poor and didn't have any choice but to sell the land, well, there again, the nearest kinsman could buy back the land, and in fact was told by God to do that, buy it back, and give it to the man who had to sell it. So what has happened is that Elimelech has died. Apparently he had to sell his land because he was poor. They were starving, and so they had to go to Moab to sell his land. So now Naomi has come back. She has no claim on this land. She has no claim. Only Elimelech would have a claim. The only hope that Naomi has is that a near relative of her husband will step forward, buy back the land, and take Ruth for his wife to raise up a new son, a line for Elimelech, to be, in other words, a goel. It's called a kinsman redeemer, a relative who buys back what has been lost and restores it to the one who lost it. Does that make sense to you? You understand that? So this is the great theme. The great theme is the theme of redemption. That's why we sang today. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. So the great theme of the book of Ruth is redemption by a kinsman redeemer. Boaz is related to Elimelech. Now, you know from the story, if you've read the story, you know that there's actually a redeemer who is closer kin than Boaz. So Boaz says to Ruth, when she approached him about this, about being the redeemer, he says, well, I'll do it. However, there is a relative who is closer than I am, and he has the right of first refusal. So the next day, Boaz goes into the town square, and that man, who is the near relative, is there. And so Boaz approaches him and says, you have the responsibility of the redeemer for Naomi to buy back the land that Elimelech sold. And, that's your right. And so the man says, I'll do it. But then Boaz adds this little note, but when you do, you also have to marry Ruth. At that point, the other candidate had to say, no, I can't do it. He doesn't explain exactly. He just says it would endanger my own inheritance. We don't know what that means. Doesn't matter. But whatever it was, he couldn't do it. And so now Boaz is the next in line. They make an agreement. They exchange sandals. That's the way they made the agreement public and witnessed it. And so Boaz then marries Ruth, and the rest, as you know, is the history of the book. So the book of Ruth, the theme of the book of Ruth is redemption. And that theme runs all through the Bible. In fact, many times in the Old Testament, God himself is referred to as the Goel. And I want you to turn with me just for a moment. There are several places in the New Testament that speak this same way, but I'm going to ask you to look at one with me. Okay? Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. I thought about this too late, Josiah. This would have been the one I would have had you read if I had thought about it sooner, but it didn't come to mind sooner, so here we are. But in Galatians chapter 4, Paul is writing, of course, to Christians in the Galatian churches that he established on the first missionary journey, which had kind of been caught up in Jewish, kind of a Jewish heresy. But at any rate, Paul is going to use in his letter an image that they would have all understood from the Old Testament. This image of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. And look at what he says. This is in Galatians chapter 4 and beginning in verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, just like all of us were. Right? I don't think there are any exceptions to that. Was anybody here hatched? I might wonder about some, but no. We were all born the usual way. A child was born just the other day, came to the earth in the usual way. So we were all born of women, just as Jesus was. He is our kinsman. You do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feelings of your infirmities, but he was tempted at all points just as you are, yet without sin. Jesus is our kinsman. He is like us. As Michael Card says, is one of his songs, I love this. He says, a man who was unlike any other man, and yet so much like me, was Jesus, our kinsman. Our kinsman redeemer. I didn't read the rest of it, did I? But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to do what, church? To redeem, to buy back those who are under the law. That's every one of us. You know, a lot of people, whether they're saved or not, a lot of people have this idea that being a Christian is something like, how should I say it? Something like being a Cadillac instead of a Chevy. You know, a Cadillac is just a souped-up Chevy. Like an Acura is a souped-up Honda. And Infiniti is a souped-up Nissan. Okay? And a lot of people think that, well, being a Christian is just sort of being, you know, everybody should be honest. Everybody should be decent. Christians are just a little more decent. That makes sense? That's kind of the way a lot of people think about the Christian faith. No, 1,000 times no. What the Bible teaches is this: you are dead in trespasses and sins. You are without God and without hope. You are Naomi. You have no hope in this world at all, unless there's a Boaz to redeem you. And that's Jesus. He is like us, born of woman, just as we are. Our kinsman, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem. Thanks be to God. Let's stand. Invitation to another league. Why do I not